Will there ever be accountability for what happened on the first day of the US Israel war in Iran when a missile struck a school, killing 120 children? It's been 5 months now since that attack, what's believed to be the deadliest civilian strike of the war so far. Experts say the evidence indicates that it was American forces that hit the school, but the US government has not admitted responsibility and says it's still investigating. Now, the BBC has visited the site of the school and spoken to Iranians about what they saw. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid in Washington, D.C., and welcome to The Global Story on YouTube, our show about where the world and America meet. Coming up, we're going to hear from my colleague Tom Bateman, who covers the State Department for the BBC. He has been trying for months to get answers from the U.S. government about the school strike. But first, I spoke with Nawal Al-Maghafi, senior international investigations correspondent for the BBC. She's just returned from a major reporting trip to Iran, and Nawal reported inside Iran on the condition that none of her material would be used on the BBC's Persian service. These restrictions apply to all international media organizations operating in Iran.
So we got to do this extraordinary journey across the entire country. I mean, we went in via Turkey, and then from the north of the country, we traveled about 15 hours into Tehran. And then from Tehran, we took this train journey on Iran Rail. And it took us through some of the most strategic points in Iran. You know, we passed by Natanz and Fordow, the two main nuclear sites. Then we went to one of the stops was Qom, and from there to Bandar Abbas,
And
which is
Qom is
where...
the religious Shia center, is that correct?
Exactly. And then from there, we went to Bandar Abbas, which is where the Strait of Hormuz is. And, you know, we spent a couple of days in Bandar Abbas. And from Bandar Abbas, we then went to Minab, which is the site of one of the most significant attacks in this war, a school in which 156 people were killed, 120 of them children.
And what did you go there, Nawal, hoping to find out?
So initially, you know, the war broke out, and I had been speaking to the authorities asking for a visa. And it took us a couple of months, but it seemed like as soon as we said we wanted to go visit the school in Minab, that expedited things. You know, they were like, okay, you can get a visa right away, you know, send over your paperwork. You know, they told us to send our passport details right away. They put a date 2 weeks from that day for us to arrive in Iran. And things were in motion. But, you know, it's obviously the authorities steer you to go and see places that they feel like will benefit them. You know, the coverage of this.
I want to ask you about that, Noel, because I'm sure many listeners and viewers will remember that school strike to some degree. A missile hit an elementary school in southern Iran, the city of Minab, as you say. And I think it's fair to say that it became one of the defining tragedies of this war. I believe it's the deadliest known single event of civilians since the war began. Why is it your sense that the Iranian authorities were keen for you to visit? You say that they were open to it and that they allowed you and sort of expedited your visa to go and visit the site of that school.
Well, firstly, you know, let's just talk about February 28th. You know, that was quite a huge, significant day in the war. That's when the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed, right? And that was Washington and Israel's way of saying, look, we're making huge progress. We've already killed the supreme leader of this regime within the first day of the war. But on that very same day, the school in Minab, where, you know, as you say, the biggest civilian death toll of this war that we know of happened. The Iranian regime, their point of view is Washington and Israel have sold you this war, that it's going to be very strategic, that it's only going to target militants and military sites. But no, they're also killing civilians. They're killing our children. And for many Iranians on the ground, especially those who were welcoming of this intervention because they thought it would topple the regime quite quickly. What happened in Minab was huge, and it made them rethink how they felt. I'm not talking about everyone, but quite a lot of people we spoke to say, you know, we thought that this intervention would topple the regime immediately, but we didn't quite understand the human cost. And for that to have happened within the first day of this war really changed the kind of story of the war. I mean, wherever you go in Iran, these children's photos are kind of plastered on billboards everywhere. And every single person we spoke to, even without prompting them, spoke to us about Minab and how they felt about it, whether they were with the regime or whether they were against the regime. And we spoke to a lot of people off camera who are against the regime and still said, you know, that was devastating. And that really shook us, what happened. And so it's worked for them to make that case. But for us going there, I knew that would be the case. I knew that's why they really wanted to take us to the school. And so I was really kind of mindful to make sure that along the journey, we get as many voices as possible. We try and gather testimony and speak to people who were at those protests to find out how they feel about what's going on now, to get a variety of voices in Iran. And I think we were able to do that. Of course, those voices aren't on camera, because going on camera speaking against the regime can get you in serious trouble in Iran. You know, we're hearing about these executions that are taking place right now. But it was important for us to have those voices in the piece, regardless of how we illustrate them, because, you know, their stories are very important for you to get a full picture of how people feel.
No, well, it's really informative for me to hear, though, how so many people, you say, brought up the school strike unprompted, because that's how much it lives in the consciousness of how this war has unfolded in Iran. And I want to get a sense from you of what you learned about how that day unfolded, about what happened in Minab on February 28th.
So I met this teacher. Her name is Amina Nadimi, and she was the first grade teacher. She had taught first grade for about 6 years in this school, the Shajara Tayyiba school in Minab. And so she knew, you know, children in first grade, second grade, third grade, all the way till the 6th grade, because she taught them in their first year in that school. And she told me that on that day, you know, they didn't even know that the war had broken out as they went to school. And it was just another day at school. You know, the children were in their classrooms. It was Ramadan. And so a lot of the children, the older children, were fasting. And instead of doing assembly outside in the garden, they were all in the prayer room reciting Quran because of Ramadan. And she said that the head teacher had heard that the war had broken out. And she at first thought, well, they're not going to hit Minab. You know, there's nothing significant, you know, of military significance in Minab. And then she heard that they had attacked Minab quite far away. And so she decided to call all the parents and tell them, you need to pick up your kids because we don't know what's going to happen. And so many parents started arriving. And some of them were successful in picking up their kids and getting away from the school. And then the attack happened. So the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have this compound, and the school is within that compound. Now, many people told us that this compound hadn't been used for military purposes for over 10 years. But still, the school is within that compound. It has its own gate. It's fenced off, but it's all quite close to each other. And so they'd hit the compound, and that really shook the school. You know, a lot of people who were in the school thought it was the school itself that had been hit. So a lot of people had started to flee. But Amina Nadimi tells me, you know, my kids were in first grade. I couldn't let them just run out by themselves. And then she said, you know, within moments of me trying to get their backpacks on because they refused to leave without them, the other strike happened, and then everything went black. She was hit in the head. And she said, you know, the kids that were with her, she held them so tightly. I think 5 of them survived. And then when she came out of the rubble, she thought that all those children whose parents had come for them had escaped. And then what she realized was that they hadn't made it out of the school because so many parents were rushing in when they heard the first attack. Those ones who were trying to leave couldn't get out and were actually caught up in the heart of the strike. So all of them were killed in the attack. And then, you know, we spoke to Reza, who was the first Red Crescent first responder to come to the scene. And, you know, Minab is a very tight-knit community. Everyone knows each other. It's a very small city. And he said as soon as he ran in, he saw a relative and he just could not get himself to tell her that her daughter had been killed. And this is a young man. I mean, he's volunteering. A lot of these Red Crescent guys in Iran are volunteers with very little training who are doing it for free. So nothing could have prepared him or anyone for what happened. And honestly, I had read so much about the school, but nothing prepares you for the gravity and magnitude of what happened until you walk through those empty classrooms. I mean, for me,
And do you walk through empty classrooms, Nawal? Does the school still look like a school?
So most of it is rubble. And when I arrived, this is 4 months on, they are still sifting through the rubble because one family still has no remains for their son. And as they were sifting through the rubble, they found this notebook of a young girl called Maya Salari, and she was 8 years old. She was killed with her brother, who was in the first grade, and their mother had picked them up. And so she was killed too. And then you can only see 2 classrooms that are still standing. Yes, there's 2 classrooms and a hallway. Everything else is destroyed. But in those 2 classrooms are, what a normal children's classroom looks like in any school. Even here, you saw the writing on the walls, their homework hanging on the walls, balloons, paintings, children's desks, pencil cases, school bags. I've gone to a lot of different bombing sites throughout my career. But going to a children's school whilst parents are still visiting every day and in mourning was incredibly hard. And I think what was particularly hard was going to the grave site. So there is a cemetery only for the children that were killed in the school and teachers and parents who were killed. And it is just so harrowing. I mean, it is just row after row of little small graves. And what really struck me, I think, was the siblings who are still alive. There was this young girl who was rollerblading in this cemetery through the graves. And obviously she's so little and she doesn't understand what has happened because she's so young. She shouldn't need to understand something like this. And it really made me think of my own children. And I was like, how would you even explain this to a child, what happened?
Yeah. It's really, really humbling to hear you describe what you heard and what you saw in Minab, because from a news perspective, at least here in Washington, D.C., the Iran war story has moved on from the strike on that school. There were many, many more strikes after that first day. Then, of course, there was the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, a focus on the economic impact worldwide, then talk of a ceasefire or maybe not a ceasefire. But it's very clear in hearing from you that the Iranian families grieving the loss of their children, life has not moved on.
It definitely hasn't moved on. When we were at the school, they were holding a prayer, and they hold it every day. And all the parents and teachers who survived come together in that site of rubble and pray together. But, it's very hard for them to move on when they haven't had any answers. They haven't had a clear answer about who was responsible for the killing of their children and their colleagues and, fellow parents. And that is something that really came across while speaking to people, is they want accountability.
Who do they blame?
Well, I mean, of course, all the reporting and all the evidence suggests that the US was responsible for this attack. But
and did that come up in your conversations?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people were talking about it being the US. Of course, in Minab, they say, a lot of them said Trump is responsible for what happened in the school.
Individually.
Yeah, individually, exactly. One of the mothers I spoke to, Masume, her daughter Sateyesh, who was 9 years old, was killed in the school. And she has other daughters. They were sitting with her beside the grave of Sateyesh. And she was just, before I even started to interview her, just crying. And her daughters are comforting her, but I'm sure they feel, it is just as hard for them to process what has happened to their sister as it is for her at the loss of her daughter. And she was so angry when I brought up the question of the US and what she feels about the fact that no investigation has been concluded. And, you know, she was so angry. She sent a message to President Trump.
دکتران نابود بشه تا خون بچه ها خرد بشه درد گرفتار بشه که هممون بفهم.
Nawal, we're now quite a few months on from when that first strike on the school took place, and since this war began, did you get a sense from any of the people you spoke with that there is a growing frustration at all with their own Iranian government, with the war itself? Or is most of the frustration directed towards the US government and towards President Trump?
We got a mix of responses to that question. You know, of course, the people we spoke to on camera have to be really careful about what they say. They know that the government will watch these interviews and that they could get themselves in serious trouble if they say anything against the government. And so many of them told us, you know, that they want this war to end, that the impact of this war, especially economically, is, you know, having a huge impact on their lives. And that they feel the regime is winning this war. You know, a lot of people told us it has unified us. Even if you were against the regime beforehand, now you're with it because you don't want this foreign intervention. But then also we spoke to people off camera, people whose testimony we kept anonymous. And, you know, one of them said, I welcomed this war, but I feel like the kind of ambitions of this war have changed. And then we also spoke to someone else, Bahar, who said, I'm calling her Bahar, but that's not her real name. And she told us, I do think that the government has become weaker.
Thus far, no one has claimed responsibility in the aftermath. And I want to understand, Nawal, how has this actually unfolded in terms of who is deemed to be responsible and what evidence there is for that?
So on the day of the attack, there were two waves of attacks. One wave, which happened early in the morning, which is when the school itself was hit. And there is no video footage of that attack specifically. And then a little while later, there is another wave of attacks that is captured on video that hit the neighboring IRGC compound. And when I say neighboring, it is a couple of meters away. It's very close by.
There is a fence separating the two?
There is a
separating the
fence
school from this
separating the two,
military?
but they are within the same compound.
I see.
So the school is a rectangle within this bigger rectangle compound. And the second wave of strikes were captured on film. And when experts see this video, they can see that that wave of strikes was Tomahawk missiles. And obviously, out of all the warring parties that are active in Iran right now, the United States is the only state that has Tomahawk missiles. Exactly. And also experts say that usually you wouldn't use different types of weapons within the same attack. And so if you had used Tomahawks in the second wave, you would have used them in the first wave. In addition to that, there is the crater that was left behind in the heart of the school. Now, some experts have analyzed that crater, and they have said that that crater looks like the kind of crater that would be left behind by a Tomahawk missile. And so all of that evidence put together does point to the United States being responsible. But until the United States releases the findings of its own investigation, it is very hard to say unequivocally that they were responsible, even if all the evidence points towards them. Now,
no, well, I'm curious, the crater you mentioned, by the way, when you went to the site of the school, do you still see evidence of that crater?
yes.
Do you see any missile fragments, or have those all been removed?
We haven't seen any missile fragments, and the regime did present missile fragments in the beginning, a few days, I think, after the attack happened. And they were fragments of a Tomahawk missile. But of course, they presented them. They aren't independent. You know, it's not like an independent team of experts went to the site itself and found those remnants. So, you know, you have to take that with a pinch of salt as well, because it was presented by the regime. And you know, in addition to that, Reuters and CNN, they say that they've seen a preliminary version of this investigation by the US. And in that preliminary report, it does say that the US is responsible and that the mistake was made because of the use of old data.
That does lead me to wonder how and where this all ends. We are now 5 months into this war. How did the people you met see this all ending?
I don't think anyone knows. I don't even think the warring parties involved in this conflict know how it will end. But I think it's really important to add that two things can be true at the same time. You can be anti the regime and want the regime to fall and want change for your country, but also be against this foreign intervention in your country. And I think that's something that's kind of been lost in some of the coverage. People think, well, if they don't want the war, then they must be pro-regime. And that's not true. A lot of Iranians we spoke to do want change, do want a better future, feel oppressed and are afraid of the government, but also don't want bombs dropping on their homes, and don't feel that this war is achieving anything that will get them any closer to what they're hopeful for.
Well, thank you, Nawal, for bringing your reporting. I really appreciate the fact that you were able to bring us these insights and tell us what life has been like inside Iran, because it's an extraordinarily unusual experience. We don't hear this perspective often.
Thank you so much for having me, Asma. It's always a pleasure.
As Nawal alluded to, we still do not have answers from the US government about what happened with that school strike, and we wanted to understand why. So I've turned to my colleague, Tom Bateman. He covers the State Department for the BBC.
When this war started, it was really noticeable to me when you look at the communications that the US military and US Central Command, which is based in the region there, was very actively from day one in its view, calling out what it said were the lies of the Iranian regime. So there were lots of instances where the Iranians were saying, this has been struck, or, we fired a missile that's hit an American aircraft carrier. And on the US CENTCOM social media feed, they were saying, big sort of captioned things saying, this is a lie, this is not true. And when it came to, this news began to emerge that a school had been hit in Minab and a large number of children killed in what looked like an absolutely devastating incident. And obviously the Iranians were talking about this as state media was starting to show what had happened. And when I looked at so there was nothing on the US military's social media feeds about that. And when I looked, I think it was the following morning, on their website for any kind of statement, it simply said, this incident is under investigation.
The day the war started.
And not just the first day, the first few hours. This was right at the start. And that's another point, I think, which is really significant about this, because remember that this war began in the daytime. And the reasons for that, we assume, are because that's when the Israelis and the Americans had intelligence of the whereabouts of the supreme leader, which was the starting point that they killed him. And this is a question I put to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, during one of these moments where I questioned him, is that those children were still at school and they hadn't had time to evacuate, most of them by that point, and the building got hit. And I put that to Marco Rubio at one point, wasn't this reckless? Because if you were trying to mitigate civilian harm, you would start military action usually during the night. That's why wars often start, these kind of aerial campaigns often take place at night time. When
did you begin to hear a recognition from the Trump administration about what had actually happened, and what was their initial response?
The very, very first response was, from memory, from US Central Command's press office, where they had been asked, what had happened here. Was this the US that hit the school? And there was just a one-line statement where they had said, this incident is under investigation.
Here we are, several months later. What's the current status of those investigations?
Well, what we know is that there was an internal initial probe by the Pentagon that has not been made public. But the top lines of it leaked around the time, that found that investigators believed this was likely the result of a US strike, but that they would continue investigating to gather more information. We're nearly 5 months on now, and we still are none the wiser as to where that investigation is going, when it will be released. Now, the other element to this is that President Trump has been asked multiple times now about the Minab strike. I asked him on Air Force One a few months ago, and what has happened there is he has tended to equivocate, to say things like, well, it might have been the Iranians. We don't think it was us. I asked him specifically on Air Force One, was this a US missile? Do you know now? And he repeated that line, we're investigating it. When I pushed again, he got really quite angry. And again, he was asked,
you just suggested that Iran somehow got its hands on a Tomahawk and bombed its own elementary school on the first day of the war. But you're the only person in your government saying this. Even your defense secretary wouldn't say that when he was asked, standing over your shoulder on your plane on Saturday. Why are you the only person saying this?
Because I just don't know enough about it. I think it's something that I was told is under investigation. But Tomahawks are used by others, as you know. Numerous other nations have Tomahawks. They buy them from us. But I will certainly, whatever the report shows, I'm willing to live with that report.
So you have already a contradiction there, because he's saying he hadn't seen the report about the information, but was offering a sort of theory about what had actually happened. American missiles are precision guided. They're feeding data back to satellites. They know where they're going. Some have cameras in them. So it's likely that they knew very early on exactly what had happened here. Certainly that is the view of the experts that I've spoken to. The issue is likely to be, frankly, that if the system has found one thing, and the Pentagon knows that internally, but the commander-in-chief, in the form of the president, has said something almost entirely diametrically opposed to that, within the Trump administration, it gets pretty difficult for them to put out a report that completely contradicts what the president has said. So that may be a factor here.
How out of the ordinary would you say the administration's response has been to this all?
I looked back at several other cases in the last 30 years where there had been American strikes that had killed a large number of civilians. And in almost all of those, you could see that there'd often be, at the start, again, the fog of war, an attempt perhaps by the US to suggest that it might not have been them, or to sort of talk about the mitigating factors. But pretty quickly, when journalists start looking into these cases, you will have had an admission by the Americans, yes, we did it. It was a terrible mistake. Here's why it happened. We're continuing to look into it, and sometimes an apology, sometimes even compensation.
Thank you for pressing the administration on this issue, and also thank you for joining us here on The Global Story.
Thanks so much, guys.
That's it for The Global Story on YouTube. Thanks for spending some time with us. And if you want to hear more from us, I should note that The Global Story is also an audio podcast, so you can find us every weekday on bbc.com or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.